So Keynes set government the task of maintaining an aggregate level of spending sufficient to maintain full employment. And that was the aim of British governments, and of course it was embodied in the American Full Employment Act of 1946, which committed the US government to maintain a high and stable level of employment. To make it easier for governments to do this, Keynes argued that it was necessary to secure a more equal distribution of wealth and income. Too much money piled up in too few hands increased the instability of economies, since steady investment depends on a steady general demand for goods and services. That's a big issue, and I'll return to that in my conclusion. Now, I've broached a whole lot of contentious matters, and I've only been able to skim the surfaces of them, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. But let me leave you with the final concluding, some three final concluding thoughts. The first concerns the state of economics. Broadly speaking, it's been useless in explaining or prescribing for the current crisis. Any good things have not come out of the economics profession. They have come out of the instinctive response of politicians that they cannot risk another Great Depression. What the chances of this Great Depression were, we can argue about, but they had 1929 to 32 in their mind, and Hitler as one of the consequences. No politician who has any sense of public responsibility can afford to take the advice of Eugene Farmer or John Cochrane of Chicago University. And the basic reason for the failure of economics lies deep in the history of economic thought itself. In his massive history of economics, Schumpeter, great Austrian economist, referred repeatedly to the Ricardian vice, by which he meant the vice of abstraction. I prefer to call it physics envy. Economists have wanted their discipline to be as much like a natural science as possible, in which the human world is modeled as a slightly more complicated version of the natural world. Yet if economics was really like a natural science, we wouldn't be having all these debates, because there'd be no equivalence in today's economics of Ptolemaic astronomers or believers in the phlogiston theory of energy. Yet what we actually see are interminable disagreements, the same debates, year after year, century after century. No progress at all, but the same things disguised by increasingly sophisticated math. And today's debates are simply reruns of the debates that were taking place at the time of the Great Depression. Now, Keynes understood economics to be what he called a moral and not a natural science, by which he meant it had to deal with questions of value and intention. He said it was as if the fall of the apple to the ground depended on mistaken calculations on the part of the apple about its distance from the ground and about whether the apple wanted to fall to the ground in the first place. That's what we actually have to deal with in human behavior. In other words, our account of human behavior must not just allow for miscalculation, but also for, David, you called it epistemological modesty. One could call it ontological indeterminacy, if one wants to extend that thought. But basically, that the future is inherently uncertain and depends on what we do in order to unfold. To wean economics from physics envy is the most difficult intellectual challenge, and I think it requires a complete reconstruction of economics education, starting even in high school, but going through college. That's something that we've got to work on. Secondly, we have to start taking seriously, once again, the question of the distribution of wealth and income, and its relationship to welfare, well-being, stability, and happiness, and more generally, the good life. At one time, welfare economics dealt with such questions. It was a major branch of economics. It's virtually disappeared now. From not only from economics syllabuses, but from general public discussion. For example, access to credit has replaced the welfare state as the keystone of today's social bargain, access to cheap credit. But one can't build social consensus on growing indebtedness. I mean, very much your point. Finally, we must make a sustained intellectual effort to rehabilitate the role of government. I mean, in the last 30 years, the majority view, especially, I think, in this country, is that government is the problem, markets are the solution. However badly markets do, governments are going to do worse. Now, governments often are to blame. I don't deny that, but not always. And markets can fail badly, as the present crisis has amply proved. Even now, when government tries to do something to cut off another Great Depression, Conservative spokesmen are loud in their complaints about boondoggles, pork barrel politics, and the like. That's the only thing they can see in government action. All true, but what would you prefer? Another Great Depression to purge the rottenness out of the system, or government efforts to save millions of people from the pain of such purging? Keynes was a philosopher of the middle way. He came not to destroy capitalism, but to make markets safe for the world, and the world safe for markets. This was very much also, I think, in the spirit of the founders of the Committee for Economic Development, who believed, as has been said, in a partnership between government and a free enterprise system, and not a dogfight. We need, as a matter of urgency, to recapture that spirit today. Otherwise, we'll simply limp from one crisis to the next. Thank you.
What should our leaders be telling the people? I mean, we seem to be getting mixed signals. On the one hand, people say it's good to save. The savings rate's now gone from -1 to 5%. On the other hand, politicians tell us that, 60-70% of GDP is driven by consumer demand. So we're being told at the same time, spend more, save more. And we're telling the Chinese to be more like us, that they need to increase their consumer demand, at least internally, but yet we also like the fact that they save a lot because they buy our notes. So how do we get it? What's the message? It seems to be inconsistent. What would Keynes say?
Well, is it too difficult to explain that prudent conduct when you're at full employment is not the same as prudent conduct when for government? I mean, when the economy has lost 5 or 6% of GDP and unemployment has doubled. You know, if you're at full employment, all the precepts of prudent economics, as we understand them, are right. They are absolutely right. In other words, governments should not run deficits. We should not increase the national debt. We should pay off debt, and similarly, households should save. Normally, they should save a proportion of their income and not spend. And especially when they're in debt, they should try and if they can, pay back their debt, and that's exactly what they're doing now. I mean, we entered this crisis for moral reasons or other sorts of reasons as a very heavily indebted society, private debt. And therefore, people naturally look to pay it off. But that also decreases aggregate demand. When people are saving an increased proportion of their income, that means they're spending less of it. And when I spend less, your income suffers. And when your income suffers, someone else's income suffers. So this chain is quite understandable when the economy is sliding, this private response. But that means that you need a larger stimulus by the government in order to cut off this downward spiral. Now, is that very difficult to explain? Maybe it is.